So good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming today. Welcome to our 2021 Didsbury Lectures. To all of you who are online over there, and very warm greetings to all of you who came in person. The Didsbury Lectures is a well-established series that goes all the way back to 1979, the decade I was born in. When the college instituted an annual lecture series. The late Professor F.F. Bruce was the first one to present his lectures. Since then, a number of well-known scholars in the UK or with very close connection to the UK were honorable Didsbury lecturers. Reverend Professor Morna Hooker, who just celebrated her 19th birthday this year. Professor Richard Bauckham, the Reverend Dr. Nancy Wright, Professor Elaine Graham, Professor Michael Gorman, just to name a few. Many speakers who left an undeniable mark on British scholarship and worldwide scholarship, I should say, delivered Didsbury Lectures. The late Reverend Professors Torrance, James Dunn, Howard Marshall, C.K. Barrett, and others. You can see the full list of speakers together with available resources from the previous lectures on the college's website and in the subsequent publications of those scholars. This is our 43rd annual series of Didsbury Lectures, and it is my honor to introduce to you today our Didsbury lecturer speaker, Lightfoot Professor of Divinity, Professor John Barclay. Professor John Barclay is trained in both classics and theology at Queen's College, Cambridge. Completed his PhD on Galatians at Cambridge before becoming lecturer, then senior lecturer, then professor at Glasgow University, where he worked from 1984 to 2003. Since 2003, Professor Barclay has been holding the position at Durham University as Lightfoot Professor of Divinity. Professor Barclay has a broad range of interests in the area of the New Testament and early Judaism. He worked on the social history of early Christianity, especially in Pauline Christianity or Pauline churches, that resulted in 1996 publication of Jews in the Mediterranean diaspora. He was also involved in study of Judaism in the Roman world and some elements of post-colonial theory. He edited a collection of essays called Pauline Churches and Diaspora Jews, published in 2011 and then revisited and republished later by Erdmans. Overall, the number of publications by John Barclay, beginning from various monographs all the way to the chapters in numerous books, articles in the journals, edited books, book reviews, is absolutely impressive. And I'm sure that almost all of us are familiar at least with some of them. We just had a lively discussion on one of Professor Barclay's articles in my Corinthian class. The most recent major book by John Barclay is obviously his study of Pauline theology from the perspective of the theology of grace, called Paul and the Gift, published in 2015. This research is looking at Paul's theology of grace or divine gift in the light of ancient notions of gift, and explores the theological and social significance of the incongruity of grace in the formation of innovative communities. This book was highly appreciated by scholarship. John Barclay intends to offer a second volume focusing on human gift reciprocity and the construction of the community in Paul's letters in the context of social reciprocity in antiquity, challenging some of the modern notions of altruism. So we are delighted that Didsbury Lectures will create space for us to listen to some of Professor Barclay's insight from this new research titled Beyond Charity, Rethinking Gift and Community with Paul. Professor Barclay is not only an acknowledged researcher and well-known scholar, but he also shares his experience and passes his extensive knowledge to a great number of students. He teaches at undergraduate and master's level and has a long history of supervising postgraduate students. He actively participates at conferences and always lively engaged in conversations with other scholars and students. This is where I met and had a chance to chat with Professor Barclay, I think, for the first time. He is currently President of Theology and Religion or Religious Studies in the UK, the body that represents and coordinates all the departments of theology and religion or religious studies in the UK, together with other subject associations. In his biography posited on the Durham website, John Barclay admits that he also enjoys his time with his family, likes cycling, music, and watching rugby. So we are delighted to welcome John Barclay tonight and look forward to his first lecture titled Modern Charity, Where Did We Go Wrong? Please welcome Professor Barclay.
Thank you so much, Svetlana, for your lovely introduction. And it's a huge honor and a privilege for me to be invited to give these Didsbury Lectures this year. Thank you to Kent Brower for organizing, and to the principal, Deirdre Latz, for hosting these lectures, and for the Nazarene Theological College. And thank you, all of you, for coming. It's just lovely to see people, some people here face to face, and it's great to have others online, and I'm delighted you're able to join us in that way. This is such a treat to actually be able to return towards what we enjoyed before, and I'm really pleased that you can join us in one way or another. Now, these 4 lectures this week fit together in a flow, but I've also tried to make each one of them relatively self-contained. So if you're not able to come to all of them, I hope you'll at least get some benefit from each one. I know 4 in a row is a lot to attend, but I'm hoping that you'll, as I say, even on an individual one, have something of benefit. It's a challenge for me and a great pleasure to work through with you some issues that have been bothering me for a while, and I'm looking forward very much to your comments and your critiques and your questions, which I think can come online as well as here in person as we grapple with this subject together. You'll see in a handout, I think, that you should have an outline, a kind of structural outline of what we're doing today, and I hope that'll just give you a map as we go through, and you'll see where we are, and you'll be happy when we get to part 3, for instance, and we'll take it from there. Now, my title, Beyond Charity, indicates the problem I want to explore. A few weeks ago, you may remember a debate about how much COVID vaccine the West should be donating to other parts of the world. Still a very hot issue. And the World Health Authority came out with a statement that insisted that sharing vaccines in our globalized context is not a matter of charity, but of self-interest. For our own safety, they said, we all need other people to be vaccinated, so that supporting the COVAX rollout of the vaccines to the global south should not be figured as charity, but as acting in the interests of ourselves. The language they used reflects a deep-seated dichotomy an either-or, a binary thought structure that has come to dominate particularly Western discourse on gift. On the one hand, there is charity or philanthropy that is wholly for the other, that is disinterested, that entails no benefit to the giver, giving that is strictly one way. And on the other hand, there is what we call self-interest, transactions of exchange that benefit the giver and should not be classified or classed as charity. Charity has come to be defined as top-down, one way, a gift with no strings attached. And when you add in a zero-sum calculation of goods, exclusive goods, that is to say, if it's 100% for the benefit of the recipient, it must be 0% for the benefit of the giver. In this binary construct, disinterest is the polar opposite to self-interest. And selflessness is pitted against selfishness. If I give you a gift, and there is also gain for me, I have, we think, diminished or sullied the gift, tainting it with an element of selfishness or self-interest. Charity we associate with selflessness, self-negation, even self-sacrifice, on the assumption that the interests of the self are necessarily in conflict with the interests of the other, so that the greater the benefit to one, the less the benefit to the other. Now, as soon as I spell it out in this way, you may sense there's something problematic with that model. But it's become so deeply ingrained in our thought structures and our language that it's hard to pinpoint what is wrong, and even harder to move beyond it. In fact, it's a model that's become so deeply allied with an interpretation of the Christian ethic of love that it's become almost second nature for modern Western Christians to think in this way. Surely love, we think, means seeking the interests of others, not our own. Christians are called to deny themselves and take up their cross, and they follow a Lord who warned against seeking honor in giving. Don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. A Lord who himself accepted the path of love and service all the way to the cross. So is there not a neat fit between selfless charity and the Christian ethos of love? Is there not indeed a distinctively Christian source for the notion that when we give to others, we should seek no good for ourselves? Now, in these lectures, I'm going to argue for an alternative view. I will claim that the strict polarity we have created between the self and the other is the product of a set of philosophical, social, and economic developments in the modern West that have distorted older and more nuanced traditions, including the biblical sources for Christian thought and practice. These lectures will argue for the need to recover a different ethic, in which any necessary actions of self-denial or self-limitation are embedded within a larger frame in which the interests of the self are expanded and redefined within a common interest. What I'm going to argue for is an ethical structure in which the self of the giver is not ultimately negated or lost in giving, but becomes a co-participant in the common good. The goal of the gift, I shall argue, is not more for you and less for me. The goal is a common benefit in shared goods, reciprocal relationships, and conjoint flourishing. Although I'm going to touch on some of the gospel traditions in this regard, my main focus will be on resources in Paul's letters, which offer more to this discussion than has usually been noticed. Paul was, in social terms, a community builder. He faced the extraordinary difficulty of creating new communities built on trust and on gift across traditional networks, across the boundaries of ethnicity, gender, social status, and wealth. He needed to think innovatively about the social life of these communities in the light of the Christ event, and he did so in highly creative ways. I want to mine some of these resources with you in the hope of creating a better mode of thinking that I'm calling beyond charity. Now, you might wonder why we need to go that way. What's wrong with the mindset that we have at the moment, the model of charity as disinterested, one-way, and top-down? Well, it's not for nothing that books have been written recently with titles such as Toxic Charity, or Where Helping Hurts, or Dead Aid. It's become increasingly obvious in recent decades that Western models of international aid and social policies of top-down charitable intervention are seriously flawed, and for multiple reasons. In the first place, charity is often patronizing and condescending, a gift from an all-sufficient donor to a recipient who is defined only in negative terms, as poor or deprived or merely developing. Top-down aid or philanthropy can crush, demean, and disable its recipients, destroying their dignity and undermining their agency. Too often, individuals, communities, and whole countries, even whole continents, have been defined in terms of deficit and lack, as recipients of aid rather than as co-partners in a relationship of mutual benefit. Charity, as normally defined, may be necessary in the short term as emergency aid, but in the long term, it can disempower its recipients, creating dependency and passivity, rather than recognizing the gifts and developing the capabilities of the recipients. But the modern model of charity, which pits self-interest against the interests of others, can also have a damaging effect on the givers themselves. In some cases, it is simply unsustainable, as when local churches, desiring to serve their communities, spend all their resources in the hope to be a Lady Bountiful giver, seeking nothing in return, until they reach the point of exhaustion, and a potential partnership between church and community ends in collapse. In other cases, it encourages in the giver a sense of superiority and sufficiency, turning relationships of mutual support into awkwardness and arrogance, as the one-way gift alienates the recipient of the gift from the autonomous, all-powerful giver. Thus, the gift becomes oppressive, a tool of manipulation, ironically unwelcome to the recipient. In other cases, again, a self-other polarity, when it legitimates an ideal of self-negation, can create pressure towards unhealthy self-sacrifice, where the giver is encouraged to give themselves away and sacrifice their own worth or fulfillment in the process. This is the focus of a proper feminist critique of a Christian ethos that idealizes sacrifice and suffering, since it is often women in particular who are one-sidedly expected to sacrifice their interests by appeal to a Christian ethos of disinterested love. But it's not just these negative effects of charity that require us to explore the resources we will examine in these lectures. Perhaps the greatest gap in our current political discourse and in social and economic policy is a vision of society bound together by mutual contribution, by reciprocal benefit, and by the common good. As we seek to rebuild society post-pandemic, internationally, nationally, and locally, it's not enough, I believe, to talk about levelling up, as if all that is required is a more equitable injection of resources into individual or family bank accounts. Countering our massive and increasing inequalities is indeed a worthy goal, but it is not, I believe, an end in itself. We want people to have a stake in their communities by contributing to it. We want everyone to learn or to rediscover patterns of mutual benefit. We want those who use food banks to become able to offer food to one another, to feed the neighbor's kids when their parents are working, in networks of reciprocal generosity. In a recent report by the right-leaning think tank Onward, it was concluded that the key to solving relative deprivation is not top-down projects of resource injection, but the regeneration of neighborhood assets. The key is putting local people in charge of setting priorities. It is building new community-level institutions. It is equipping and developing the capacity of all to contribute to the common good. And that wasn't a trendy left-wing think tank, that was the right-leaning think tank Onward. At an international level, it's widely recognized that capital-intensive aid projects are effective only to the degree that they equip self-sustaining local initiatives. While some of the best developments, as you know, are based not on charity but on microloans that build local capacity and that resource communities of trust. Patterns of mutual benefit and two-way giving, resources that enable a diffused reciprocity that benefits everyone in the community, horizontal mutual aid, granting others the dignity of giving, recognizing each party as a contributor to the common good. These are the bonds that establish thick ties of interdependence and local community development. Do we have the resources for this kind of vision? Or are we stuck tongue-tied in this conversation, insisting that we want to serve, sacrifice, and give again, but with no capacity to articulate a social vision of conjoint flourishing? Are we reluctant to allow others to give to us and suspicious of actions that might have even a hint of self-interest? Or does the New Testament contain the language and the conceptual resources to make a substantial contribution to a renewed vision of the common good? That's the question I want to pursue with these, that I want to pursue with you in these lectures. So I move to my second section, the modern Western development of no return altruism. Our conceptions of charity and our difficulties in articulating an ethic of co-interest are the product of a particular trajectory in modern Western thought, and it's necessary to understand this development in order to get out from under its grip. There's a far more complex history than I can hope to cover here fully or in depth, but I want to outline the key factors, philosophical, social, and economic, that have led to our present extreme notions of charity, and to indicate briefly why these have been embraced so warmly by the modern Christian tradition. Along the way, we'll see why we have invented the word altruism and what powerful connotations it has gathered. Now, gifts have always been delicate and complex phenomena in all cultures and at all times. The anthropology of gift, initiated by Marcel Mauss in the 1920s, has been a rich source of information and reflection about gift-giving, whose power dynamics are complicated and whose cultural expressions are generally surrounded by a well-developed etiquette. In general, we can say this. In most societies and at most times, gifts, by which I mean voluntary favors of all kinds, are designed to create social ties. They generally carry the obligation on the recipient to offer a return, first in gratitude and then in some form of counter-gift. Gifts can, of course, be top-down and they can carry oppressive power, but they can also be horizontal, benefits among equals, and the reciprocal motions of gift and return are generally how the poor survive in the fluctuating conditions of ordinary life at subsistence level. There is shame in being forever the recipient of gifts, And the desire to return gifts or to take the initiative in giving and thereby building social capital is ubiquitous in non-Western cultures, past and present. The threefold pattern of gift, receipt, and return is found in most cultures and was visualized by the Greeks in the figure of the three graces. That they were usually depicted as dancing together in a circle is a sign of the circularity of the gift, and that they were depicted as attired in see-through clothing was explained by the fact that gifts desire to be seen and can achieve their desired effects only if they're recognized and known. Although the anonymous gift was sometimes considered necessary in antiquity to preserve the dignity of the recipient, it was a rare phenomenon, and by no means hallowed as the ideal gift. This pattern of gift and return, even as we say quid pro quo, may seem to us more like trade than gift, a reciprocity we associate with the market rather than with social relations among friends. But the dichotomy between market exchange and the unilateral gift is a polarity that we have created for reasons we shall examine in a moment. In most cultures and at most times, both trade and gift are forms of exchange. And they're distinguished not by the fact that gift is one way, while trade is a matter of exchange, but by the fact that but by the personal and voluntary nature of gift reciprocity over against the more formal, calculated, and sometimes impersonal forms of reciprocity which are enacted in business or over a market store. To say that gifts were part of reciprocal relationships is not to deny the possibility that gifts were given for the sake of the recipient. In the first century of the Common Era, the Stoic philosopher Seneca wrote a long and fascinating treatise examining multiple dimensions of gifts and favors, in which he was critical of gifts that pretended to benefit others but were really for the advantage of the giver. In his philosophy, the gift should be given for the sake of the virtue it expresses, not for the advantage of the giver. But he did not, this is the crucial point, he did not regard the self and the other, the giver and the recipient, as engaged in some zero-sum competition. A genuine gift for the other could also benefit oneself and was not diminished or demeaned by doing so. Similarly, in Greek discourse on friendship, such as we find in Aristotle, although some kinds of friendship could be criticized as self-serving and purely for pleasure or advantage, the best kind of friends were committed together towards the good. And what was good for one's friend was also, by definition, good for oneself. In other words, while certain kinds of self-interest were wrong, what one might call solipsistic or competitive self-interest at the expense of the other, there was not considered to be an in-principle competition between the self and the other, so long as their benefits could be shared and conjoined in a collective common good. In other words, we do hear ancient voices against gifts that do not really benefit others, against favors that operate as disguised forms of self-aggrandizement, and against gifts such as bribes that twist relationships so that they undermine the common good. But we do not hear objections to gifts that evoke returns, or to gifts that benefit both the recipients and the donors. Since ethics, morality, is directed towards human flourishing, what the Greeks called eudaimonia, it would be a poor form of moral behavior that ended up in the loss or damage of the self, if that self is properly configured. Now, a fundamental shift in thinking on this matter begins, I believe, in the early modern period in the West. Previous Christian notions of virtue, as developed by Aquinas, had embraced the ancient philosophical goal of flourishing, what we call eudaimonism. Even if love might be costly in certain respects, it did not ultimately involve a trade-off between the good of the other and the good of oneself, because God's eternal purposes were to bring all things to perfection and fulfillment. One should not love God or others for the sake of oneself, but one could trust that the deepest interests of the self were wrapped up in the divine love that wills the flourishing of all. But in the early modern period, that consensus began to break down. Calvinist notions of double predestination raised the question of whether God is to be identified with the good, or whether the good is whatever God declares it to be. And one could no longer be sure whether God willed the flourishing of all. In the Protestant Catholic disputes about reward, Christian eschatology could be reduced to the question of whether good deeds were rewarded, with the future seen not as the perfection of the good for all creation, but as an individualistic prize for good behavior. In this thinned-down version of eschatology, the giving of charity rewarded in heaven could be figured as a form of narrow self-interest. Radical questions about human nature began to be raised. In the 17th century, Thomas Hobbes, in his famous book Leviathan, posited that humans were by nature and originally concerned only for their own narrow advantage, so that the state of nature, as he put it, was a state of war, in which life was, I quote, solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. Note the solitary here. Hobbes considered that the construction of social relationships wider than the immediate family were a secondary phenomenon, an unnatural social compromise designed to prevent natural competition descending into mutual destruction. So Hobbes considered morality and the law that enforces that morality as a social construction. If we do good to others, he argued, it's not because we're naturally disposed that way, but because we have had to accept that, unfortunately, kindness is the only means of our own survival. Now, the philosophical moralists, such as the Cambridge Platonists, were appalled by Hobbes, and they argued strenuously that goodness was implanted in us by nature, or by God, which for them amounted to the same thing. But they increasingly fell prey to Hobbes's dichotomy between what is good for others and what is good for oneself. They argued against Hobbes that sacrificing ourselves for others is not unnatural, but a necessary part of the good. They were embarrassed by crude notions of the afterlife as an individualistic reward for virtue, and they tended to bracket out eschatology altogether and to argue that good is its own reward in this life, not the next, or that good is just good and doesn't need any reward at all. Now, in the 18th century, Hobbes's infamous skepticism about human goodness was amplified by a man called Bernard Mandeville, whose brilliant book, Fable of the Bees, argued that all that we think of as benevolence is really a disguised form of self-interest. At that time, a hospital had just been founded in Oxford. Why, he asked, did John Radcliffe donate all that money to found the hospital in Oxford that is still called to this day after his name? Only, suggested Mandeville, because he wanted the fame that went with the donation, not because he cared about the sick. Again, the reaction to Mandeville among moralists was strong, but he had trapped them into thinking on his own terms. True goodness, argued his critics, was directed entirely towards the other and not at all towards oneself. The dichotomy between the self and the other had become central to the discussion of morality, which to this day, I think, remains caught in the Mandeville Trap. The process I'm describing here was not merely a philosophical development. It's no accident that at precisely this time, in the 17th and 18th centuries, the main sites of this philosophical trajectory, that is Britain and France, were the birthplaces for the modern commercial and capitalist state. Now, how should one conceptualize the rise of commerce and industry, which concern not just trade but capital, and not just modest prosperity, but huge profits and enormous risks? Was this immoral or moral? Or was it in a sphere separate from morality, a kind of amoral field of behavior? Adam Smith was, of course, the person who established the framework for understanding national and international trade in his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. He was also a famous moralist, whose earlier book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, was full of comment about the natural qualities of human benevolence. But for Smith, benevolence and commerce were two separate spheres, and the patterns of one were not to be confused with the other. In a well-known passage in The Wealth of Nations, he writes, "It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect to get our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love. And we never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantage." Note the dichotomy here. One could appeal, on the one hand, to benevolence or humanity, or one could speak to the butcher of their own interest or their self-love. While charity might be suitable in a non-commercial sphere, or perhaps in relation to beggars, business is built on quite other principles, where the vendor does not give but sell, and the recipient does not express gratitude but buy. Now, this is a crucial step. As the economy becomes what they call disembedded from social relationships, as it becomes a sphere of its own, with its own rules, unrelated to morality, benevolence becomes associated with pure morality, pure precisely in being dissociated from exchange, from return, and from interest. As Jonathan Parry has argued in relation to this crucial social change, the ideology of a disinterested gift emerges in parallel with an ideology of a purely interested exchange. And both, he argues, are, in an important sense, our invention. The market is associated with reciprocal exchange, a process of quid pro quo, while gifts are associated with the absence of exchange, with non-reciprocation. From this trajectory emerges the distinctively modern and distinctively Western ideal of the unreciprocated gift. At this point, you may well be thinking, but what about those sayings of Jesus about giving without expecting a return, Luke 6? Or about inviting the poor and the lame to your banquet because they cannot give a return, Luke 14? Or about giving in secret so that you get no human reward, Matthew 6. Does Jesus not advocate precisely what I'm calling a modern Western ideal of the unreciprocated gift? Well, note the larger context. Love your enemies and lend, says Jesus, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, will be put into your lap. That's Luke 6. Invite the poor, the disabled, the lame, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Luke 14. When you give alms, don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing, so that your alms may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Matthew 6. Oh, so this is not a gift without a return. There is a return. In fact, a better return, but a different one. Not from the human recipient of the gift, but from God. and not now, but in the future. The fact that we have a tendency to blank out that eschatological return and to hail Jesus as the advocate for unreciprocated gifts is because modern Christians have become uncertain how to handle such eschatological promises, even somewhat embarrassed by them. And that's another feature of the modern Western development that I'm tracing. I remember a discussion a few months ago with an American scholar. We were talking about about Mark 10, and Peter saying, "We've given up our family and so on to follow you." And I said, "How does it go on? Those of you who've given up your family and so on to follow me, you'll receive 10,000 times more family and property and so on." He said, "Yeah, I wish Mark hadn't said that." That embarrassment was made most acute in the 19th century when, in an important development, Auguste Comte, the French positivist and father of sociology, coined the term altruism. And he constructed the polarity we know very well now between egoism on the one hand and altruism on the other. Altruism is derived from the Latin word alter and the French altrui, and Comte's categories cemented the morally weighted contrast between the self, egoism, and the other, altruism, such that any concern for the self was a dilution of altruism, tainting it with egoism, with all the negative connotations of that term. For Comte, the challenge of the modern industrializing world was to ensure what he called the ascendancy of altruism over egoism, a philosophy which he called the religion of humanity. And to this day, altruism is a concept that attracts universal approval, even awe. Now, Comte's admirer, John Stuart Mill, was attracted to the altruism-egoism polarity because it constituted a morality that retained, in his view, the best in Christian ethics. But, this was important for Mill, it surpassed Christianity because it offered a purer form of love than any religion had so far achieved. Comte wished to release ethics from what he thought of as the shackles of supernaturalism, which he took to inculcate a form of subtle egoism. And John Stuart Mill's treatise on the utility of religion develops this notion in pointed terms. The religion of humanity is, Mill insists, a better religion than any of those which are ordinarily called by that title. So what he says, for in the first place, the religion of humanity is disinterested. It carries the thoughts and feelings out of the self and fixes them on an unselfish object, loved and pursued as an end for its own sake. The religions which deal in promises and threats regarding a future life do exactly the contrary. They fasten down the thought of the person's own posthumous. They fasten down the thought to the person's own posthumous interests. They tempt him to regard the performance of his duties to others mainly as a means to his own personal salvation, and are one of the most serious obstacles to the great purpose of moral culture, which is the strengthening of the unselfish and weakening of the selfish element in our nature. In its effects on common minds, what now goes by the name of religion operates mainly through feelings of self-interest. This is a radical inferiority of the best supernatural religions compared with the religion of humanity. Today we would call this religion of humanity simply humanism. And its strategy is, as Nietzsche put it, to out-Christianize Christianity, removing its moral vision from a theological or eschatological frame, characterizing that frame as fundamentally self-centered. The point was developed to devastating effect in Feuerbach's critique of theology in his Essence of Christianity. Just as Luther had criticized Catholic practice as encouraging believers to seek selfishly their own benefit, attempting by good works to gain grace from God, so Comte and Mill turn a similar critique on religion in general and Christianity in particular as phenomena deeply infected by self-interest. The brave new morality that they advocated was superior and purer in offering a more consistent counterweight to what they called the selfish element in our nature. The strategy continues to this day. Pure, disinterested altruism is represented as a new, that is, post-Christian morality, and one that atheists such as Peter Singer can advocate with enthusiasm. Now, the term altruism can have a range of meanings, and we may distinguish between soft and hard altruism. In its softer version, altruism can mean simply the act or intention to benefit others for their own sake, and one could add to that the rider with a Kantian tone that the benefit intended should have others always as ends and never means to some other end. But Comte's egoism-altruism polarity, together with the whole trajectory we've been outlining, has often given altruism a harder edge, meaning an act or intention that brings benefit to others and specifically excludes any benefit to oneself. This we may call a kind of no-return altruism, a gift to others that has no desire or expectation or intention of benefit to oneself. On this definition, reciprocity would be an accident rather than a goal. Operating with a zero-sum mentality, any benefit to the self would reduce the benefit to the other. Since the gift must be at some level at the expense of the self, such altruism involves the loss, the denial, the renunciation, or the sacrifice of the self. On this view, even an internal reward for doing good for others may be suspect. In philosophical frameworks influenced by Hannah Arendt and Jacques Derrida, the gratification that we get from awareness of doing good to others already, in their view, annuls the gift. Good can exist, says Arendt, only when it is not perceived, even by its author. As Derrida famously insisted, for there to be gift, there must be no reciprocity, no return, no exchange, no counter-gift or debt. Not even in my own recognition of myself as a giver. Now, a rather different discourse is possible among those influenced by evolutionary biology. Because here it may be recognized that the interests of the self are not necessarily antithetical to the interests of others. Whereas philosophy, and therefore ethics, has thought increasingly in terms of the autonomous individual, what Charles Taylor called the buffered self, more biological and sociological understandings consider selfhood to arise out of social relations and to be defined by ongoing social interaction. From that perspective, the interests of the self are not located in an either-or of self versus other, but may be wrapped up in a collective we, such that the interests of others may include the interests of the self. And that would make sense of many evolutionary phenomena, such as the mother who sacrifices her individual interests for the sake of her children, or the warrior who's willing to die for his group. In each case, their own interests are embedded within the interests of others, so that the mother's interests are served precisely by the flourishing of her children. Nonetheless, it's striking how even in discussing such phenomena, we find ourselves stuck in the polarity between selfishness and selflessness, between self-interest and disinterest. Richard Dawkins is typical of this tendency. You know, in his famous book, The Selfish Gene, he attributes to our genes a kind of moral selfishness or self-interest. But he expresses the hope at the end of the book that we can, I quote, discuss ways of deliberately cultivating and nurturing a pure, disinterested altruism. There's those words again. Something that has no place in nature, something that has never existed before in the history of the world. It seems that we find it near impossible to escape the polarity we have constructed between selfishness on the one hand and pure disinterested altruism on the other. Now, elsewhere in my book, Paul and the Gift, I've traced how this distinctively modern trajectory has been aided and abetted by some strands of Christian theology. the notion of no return altruism has found particular favor within the Lutheran tradition and its Kantian offspring. Luther, you remember, was concerned to break out of gift circularity in our relationship with God, and that led him to emphasize the unilateral giving of God, who gives needing nothing in return. And Luther figures the Christian as a Christ who, quote, lives only for others and not for himself, considering nothing except the need and advantage of the neighbor. This tradition reaches its peak, perhaps, in Anders Nygren's famous book, Agape and Eros. And in Nygren's schema, Eros love is acquisitive, egocentric, a form of self-assertion or self-love, whereas agape love, by contrast, is motivated by no thought of reward. It gives itself away and is unselfish, spontaneous, and in its supreme form, self-sacrificing. Once again, the self-other polarity seems inescapable, and it's here given hefty theological weight. Now, where do we go from here? I'm on to my third section, and this is a brief one. A few years ago, Archbishop Justin Welby sent a number of tweets from the Davos gathering of world leaders about the role of gift in international relations. The biblical view of helping others, he said in his tweet, is that the giver receives more than the receiver. That has profound implications for foreign aid. A little later, he added, in God's economy, giving without expecting anything back is not a loss. We gain much ourselves in the process. I could only find one response on Twitter, but it was from someone with the Twitter name Ratbrat. And in keeping with the name, it was trenchant in its criticisms. Exactly, said Ratbrat, completely false altruism. Christianity has selfishness at its core. Now, I think actually both sides in this little spat are confused. I don't think Christian giving is necessarily defined by expecting nothing back, but I do think we need better resources to think through what makes for good reciprocity and why benefit to the other is not necessarily incompatible with benefit to oneself. Giving to others that also brings reward to the self is not selfish at its core, as Ratbrat would have it, unless one adopts a peculiarly modern hard altruism of the antithetical no-return sort that I've been outlining. What I want to do in the next 3 lectures is explore with you some resources in the letters of Paul that could help us out of these confusions and could lead us in a direction where proper, even ideal forms of giving to others do not have to exclude, in fact, may specifically include benefit to the giver. I realize that what I will argue may seem at first morally and even theologically dubious. I ask you to bear with me as I set out my case and to hold in your mind the possibility, just the possibility, that your default assumptions may be shaped by the modern trajectory that I've just traced. The possibility that the biblical resources might open up a different way of seeing things. This will require us to look closely at some texts from Paul's letters, but also to think carefully about their larger theological frames. Since gift-giving at a human level is always for Paul part of a larger theological narrative, in which the grace of God enters the human sphere to bring humanity and creation to their proper fulfillment. Now, at first glance, Paul might seem an unpromising place to go for the counterintuitive argument I'm going to be making. Did not Paul extol love precisely because, quote, it does not insist on its own way, 1 Corinthians 13? Did he not earlier in 1 Corinthians command, do not seek your own advantage but that of others? Did he not claim of himself that I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage but that of the many? Is this not precisely the self-other contrast that feeds into no return altruism? And is Paul not, therefore, a pre-modern version of precisely what I profiled in the modern age? Moreover, when Paul instructs the strong in Rome to please their neighbor and talks of Christ as not pleasing himself but taking on the insults directed at others, is he not giving Christological warrant for this self-other contrast? Does he not describe in powerful terms how Christ emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, and was obedient unto death? Philippians 2. In other words, is not the story of Christ precisely the paradigm of altruistic self-sacrifice? Is it not the heroic inspiration for what's called cruciform self-negation in service of others? Such indeed is how Paul has been read, particularly in the modern era. But I'm going to argue in these lectures that there is a deeper story and a larger frame in which all these texts need to be placed if we're to understand them aright. I'm going to argue that the necessary elements of self-denial for which Paul calls do not constitute the negation of the self to core, the self as such. They constitute the denial of the competitive self, the self that wants to flourish at the expense of others. But after and beyond that negative move, Paul also has a vision of the self-fulfilled, the self that shares with others in the good of the good news. This is a self, I'm going to argue, that's neither selfless nor selfish, but what I will label, to coin a phrase, self-with. That is, the self whose interests are integrated with and fulfilled by the flourishing of others. In other words, I will argue that despite initial appearances, Paul does not subscribe to the zero-sum, no-return form of altruism that we have adopted as our moral ideal in the modern world, because he has a robust sense of a community that flourishes in mutual benefit, where the gifts of God, brokered by humans in their giving to one another and diffused in reciprocal circulation, the gifts of God lead not to the benefit of some at the expense of others, but to the benefit and fulfillment of all. My hope is that we might find resources in Paul to get beyond the modern dysfunctions of charity and to enable us to articulate a vision of the common good in which each party benefits through its contribution to others, in which the return of the gift may be, at least in some circumstances, not an embarrassment or a diminution of the gift, but its proper fulfillment. If this constitutes, as Ratbrat would say, a kind of faux altruism, well, so much the worse, I would say, for our modern notions of altruism. In fact, both charity and altruism may prove to be problematic terms. By the end of these lectures, we might have identified some better vocabulary. Today, I can only tantalize you with that prospect, but I hope I've done enough to encourage you to stay with me, either in person or online, for the rest of our journey this week. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much. What an enriched lecture. Made lots of notes myself. I hope you followed it up as well. Can we know how many people are participating, or do we have any participants online as well? 90? 90? Wow, that's a big audience. So thank you very much again for joining us tonight, those who are here and online. We will have a few minutes, up to 15, is that okay? For questions and answers. Please think carefully what you want to ask Professor Barclay tonight, and I think I'll go both. If we have a chance to listen to the question online, we'll do that, but we'll start with Tom Noble.
Thank you very much for a
That's good.
When you mentioned neighbouring and aggregate
Yeah.
chaos, it reminded me that Oliver Donovan had reprinted a few years ago a book by John Burnley, Amor Dei Religion
Yes.
of
Yes.
Augustine,
Yes.
in which he argued that for Augustine love, Christian love, includes both aggregate and eros.
Right. Yes.
Is this a well of resources that you have perhaps used?
Yes. I know that book and I've dipped into it, but I need to do more with it. I think there is something. I think a lot of people have reacted against Anders Nygren for this, this sort of wonderfully neat schema that he created, but it is the kind of completion or the end point of a strong theological tradition. I mean, he's not aberrant in that. This very strong sense of certain kinds of love of being purely for the self, and which he calls eros love, and then the agape, which is purely for the other, and must have cleaned out of it any sense of the interests of the self. And it's that dichotomy that is, although we think, well, that's obvious, that's Christian, that's the Christian way, and you read, it's fascinating. You read secular philosophers who say, well, of course, they just assume that the Christian way is that self-sacrificing other 100%, 100% for them and not for me. And you think, no, that's actually, you go back to deeper, earlier traditions like Augustine and as I say, I mentioned Aquinas, and there is a much more nuanced sense of the self caught up with God and therefore caught up in the flourishing that God wants for us all, and not the kind of giving away of the self that we have somehow created this sort of heroic ideal of the giving away of the self. So thank you for that reference, and I'll certainly go back and look at that some more. But I'm really saying, we need to beware some of the language that we've fallen into in our kind of modern dichotomies. And I'm going to be drawing some resources on Paul, but there's lots of other resources in the theological tradition, but that I think could be brought in here. People don't often people don't often bring in Paul in this context. So I want to say, well, yes, behind Augustine is actually quite a lot of interesting things in Paul. And I'm sorry I haven't taken you to many texts today, but we will be, I should say, in the future lectures, we'll be looking at some key passages from 1 Corinthians, chapter 12 and chapter 11. We'll be going to Philippians, we'll be going to 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, and digging in depth into a few texts that I hope will help us kind of unpack this a bit more. So we'll be soaking ourselves in Paul over these next few days. Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have any questions online?
Yeah, we've got a couple actually.
Mm-hmm.
I'll ask.
Yeah, if you can come here, Josh, or so that we can hear the question. Thank you.
Yeah, hopefully there's no big words. So, one question here from Isaiah Allen. I'm interested in hearing about the role of the human will and conscious intention of the giver or recipient in this idea of reciprocal in the complex of giving. In other words, how conscious and deliberate must givers and receivers be as they participate helpfully in the full process of giving?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes. Well, I think there is something interesting actually in Paul about the inwardness of the intention, of the heart, or the word he uses often is haplotes, which is about the singleness or this single-heartedness of the giver. In other words, as we'll see when we come tomorrow to 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, he wants Corinthians not just to give, but to want to give. And he's not interested in a gift that is, as it were, extracted out of them, because that's not a genuine gift. So he has some of these concerns that we recognize and about the interiority of the intention. Our problem is, because we are so worried about anything that might be of benefit to ourselves in giving, we then scrutinize down to our motives and say, do I want something for me in this? And therefore, we try and expunge that. And so we do that internal investigation. Paul's interested in the internal, say, is this really for the other? But he doesn't mean by that it's for the other and therefore could never be of any good to me as well. In other words, he doesn't set them off as an either-or, as we'll see. He says to the Corinthians, I want you to give wholeheartedly, like the Macedonians did. This, he says, is for your benefit. We think, whoa, you shouldn't be talking about benefit here, Paul. You shouldn't be suggesting there's something for them in it. And you think, either Paul's being completely inconsistent, which is possible, or he's operating with a different mindset than our either-or. And I think that's where we get so worried about inner motivation, because we think, well, I'm giving it for you, but maybe deep, there's some tiny fragment in me that kind of wants a little bit for me out of this. And Paul would say, I'm giving it to you, 100% for you, but that doesn't mean say it's going to have no benefit for me too. And that's what I want to explore, that sort of, it's a bit mind-busting, that kind of thing, where you might say, it's 100% for you, and it's 100% for me too. Oh, my goodness, but how can 100%... Okay, he's not working with this either-or dichotomy. So I'm trying to kind of explore and explode that a bit with you. And as I say, I think there's something interesting going on, and he is interested in the inner self, the inner motivation, the desire that it's genuinely for the other, but that doesn't have to mean it's cleansed of even the remotest part of benefit for the self, because he'll then go on to say, and God loves the cheerful giver. You think, oh, you shouldn't be bringing that into this here, Paul. But you realize that, oh, so it's not quite an either-or for Paul. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, please. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm not sure if I've got a question. Might be an observation.
Right.
First, I would like to say
Could you speak up a little bit, just to be louder? Yeah.
Okay. So I just would like to say thank you very much. I'm not a theologian.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a social worker.
Great.
Sort of my background is in child protection,
Right.
community, but I am completely intrigued. I thought your idea about self-with
Yes.
resonated very, very powerfully
Uh-huh.
with me. And so I will be back.
Good.
I just wondered whether you, at the beginning, you sort of referred to COVID and then
Yeah.
everything after all of that,
Yeah.
whether you are aware of Boris Johnson's ideas about faith, New Deal, and this whole idea about removing the stigma of the church and getting sort of the partnership, state and church.
Yeah.
And charity.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a little bit aware that one of my children is actually quite involved in this sphere at the moment. I think it's very interesting that the government wants to sort of it positions itself as dealing with the economic issues, as it were, and then it's looking to the voluntary sector to deal with the social community issues. And that seems to me a kind of poverty of vision, actually, in the way that it's thinking about the leveling. It's somebody else's job to deal with building community. We'll just deal with the pay issue. And it seems to me, a richer vision of society. Of course, it involves economics, but it involves economics embedded in and part of the whole round of social prosperity. So it's not just about should people have, should their pay be increased, which is, we've just been talking about today, the minimum wage going up. It's also, and what's the purpose of that? The purpose of that is not just that they can live a better life, which of course really, really important, but also that they can be contributing to the larger matrix of the local community. And it's that sort of thickness of social vision whereby our goal is not just that we get more, as it were, individuals or individual family units who are doing better off economically, but we get more people who are able to actually as I say, contribute to and benefit from the thickness of mutuality and interdependence that makes for, in my experience, that's what makes a really well-functioning community. So I think, in a sense, it seems to me like the government's saying, well, we don't really know about community, the churches can deal with that. And in a sense, that's right. The churches are good at dealing with that. They've a long experience of dealing with that. But I'd like to see much kind of richer discourse among ourselves about interdependence, not just not just reduced to the economic, but putting the economic in a larger social frame. Yeah.
Thank you again. I think I'll go for the audience again. If you have any questions, sort of a reward for all those of you who came in person.
Sorry, people online can't hear the questions asked.
Oh, okay.
So you need to come up.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I could repeat. I could repeat. Sorry.
Yeah. Andy, please.
Thank you very much.
Do you want to come or?
Yeah, come up, Andy. Yeah, come up, Andy. Okay.
Well,
Since you're not on crutches anymore.
yes. Let's make use of these legs.
Exactly.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much, John, for a fabulous introductory lecture. As soon as you started talking, my mind went instantly to some of the compartmentalization that happens in atonement theories.
Right.
And I started thinking, well, if I sort of follow this line and God hasn't given the gift of Christ in this sort of zero-sum way that you're talking about, can we think of kind of what God is getting out of the deal, having given Christ? And does, in some way at all, what you're proposing affect how we think of the atonement?
Okay, well, thank you. I don't think I want to talk about God getting anything out of it as if God needs anything. But I do want to say this, that surely the whole purpose of the incarnation, the life and death, and the atonement and the resurrection of Jesus is that it's God giving God's self to be with us, and that we should be with God. In other words, it's precisely that self-with. And we'll talk about this tomorrow when we talk about Philippians 2. It's precisely that move, the move of self-giving love, which, as I'll say tomorrow, is not about giving God's self away, it's giving God's self into the relationship of love that he desires with his creation and with us. So God's love reaches out in order to embrace us with God. Not so that we should flourish without God, but precisely with God. And God's love is that inclusive love that wants us to be in fellowship with God. Now, you can't say, well, God was somehow sort of insufficient without that, but you can say that is the purpose of the love of God, that it should be, as I say, a love with what God has made, as he holds, as it were, brings and holds creation into the new creation life of the resurrection. So I think if you stand back, if you focus only on the cross, as I'll say tomorrow, it's an act of it looks like, well, what God is about is death. But of course, the cross is not the end of the story. And it's a very, very critical part of the story, and we'll talk about this more tomorrow. But the purpose is that the cosmos should be reordered under the lordship of Christ and in the love of God. And that is it's not an eschaton without Christ, it's an eschaton with Christ. And that's the telos, that's the goal to which it's heading. Yeah, thanks.
One more question?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah. So we have one question from online. Yeah? So, Josh.
Do you want to come up here and do it again?
Yeah. Getting mixed comments now that the sound is absolutely fine. We can turn the speakers up at home. Okay, let's find a question. So Danny Atkins, who's a PhD student here, says, how do we understand that relationship between gift and reciprocity on the divine human level? For instance, although God does want a return on his gift, in brackets, confession and worship, as in Philippians 2, doesn't that return never measure up to the gift because God's gift is greater than the human ability to give? Yeah, basically, is true reciprocity possible on the divine human level?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. A reciprocal response doesn't have to measure up to or sort of equal the gift. But the point is that and this is the complexity of it, we flourish most when we respond to God. Yeah. So it's not like God wants something out of us that's somehow at our expense. So our destiny, our fullness as creatures is precisely to respond to God in love, in gratitude, in obedience, in prayer, and so on. So that if you like, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, or the Macedonians, as Paul said, first of all they gave themselves to the Lord. So that self-offering, as it were, to God is it's absolutely not a kind of quid pro quo in the sense that we can ever give the same back to God. I mean, that would be a ridiculous notion. And we can only give out of what God has given to us. I mean, that's the most essential thing to say, isn't it? That our very life as creatures is owed to the gift of God, and our life in Christ is totally dependent on the gift of God to us in Christ. So we're not giving back something of ourselves as if we were independent from God, as if God gives us something and then we think, okay, I'll reach in my back pocket and give you something of myself back. What we give back is what we've already received. But that motion, as it were, giving back to God, is indeed how God's desire to be with us comes to its fulfillment. And as I say, it is at the same time the fulfillment of ourselves as creatures. That's what Romans 1 implies, isn't it? That humanity failed to reach up to its potential precisely because it failed to recognize God as God, and failed to give thanks to God. Yeah. So that giving of thanks, the charis returned in Eucharistia, is precisely that circle which is intended for us as creatures, and where we reach our fulfillment. So absolutely right. You're absolutely right. There's no kind of equivalence here. It would be absurd to suggest there's any kind of equivalence. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing or no sense in the return, which is actually, as I say, how our relatedness to God reaches its proper goal. Yeah.
I think we are almost exhausting all the time of our wonderful speaker today, and I think it's time already to relax for tonight. Have a cup of tea and coffee that is prepared for us in the chapel, in the cafe. You'll go through the fire exit door here, but I think for now we are going to thank Professor Barclay in a moment, and I think you will take away today lots of things to think about the idea of not ignoring selfishness, to find a way, a balance to include in that selflessness, as well as the idea of self-with. So I think that's what the audience likes as well, and the idea of fulfillment is. Looking forward to the next lecture. Please join me in thanking Professor Barclay tonight.